We're back with Clint Baker, and I had asked Clint, because we were talking about recordings made in 1932 with Charlie Green, and I didn't think he did very much after that until his death. And Clint tells me the story of him freezing to death in Harlem on a doorstep is made up.
Yeah, I think that's not true. And because my wife, Elisa Clancy, who's a jazz person also, she's a jazz host, became obsessed with a book called Death in Jazz or something like that. I can't remember the thing. And it goes to debunk the myths of how musicians died. And it turns out Charlie Green just died of pneumonia sometime in the 30s, I think 1936, which means he probably was an alcoholic, because that's how you die of pneumonia. And as a young man, he wasn't a particularly old man. He was also a big dude, large man. And he apparently was quite a presence aside from being on the bandstand. So I think Charlie Green is a musician who doesn't get enough credit and deserves a little bit more credit in the big pantheon of jazz history, because he serves as a bridge to another guy who's extremely important to jazz trombone, a guy named Jimmy Harrison. Now, Jimmy Harrison also is important because he's also the bridge and connected to Jack Teagarden, who, of course, looms the largest maybe of anybody in the pre-bebop trombone era as a soloist. So I think I'll talk about Jimmy Harrison. I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of Jimmy Harrison. I have some pet recordings that I like of Jimmy Harrison's that tell a lot of the story. The first one I'm thinking of is tying him to Charlie Green. He took Charlie Green's place on the Dixie Stompers records. I think he probably Charlie Green left the band or whatever, Jimmy Harrison came in. And Jimmy Harrison's kind of interesting. I guess he was like a almost professional level baseball player. He loved to play chess. He was a big reader. He wasn't your typical musician. I don't think he was a big boozer. I think he was a kind of straight guy. And he didn't take the trombone up, I don't think, until later in his life. I think he was not a child prodigy by any stretch of imagination. I think people say he kind of arrived fully formed, like, here's this guy and bam, he's playing at a high level. But he clearly was influenced by Charlie Green, because there's a record of Oh Baby by the same band, the Dixie Stompers, Fletcher Henderson's Dixie Stompers. And I couldn't believe it the first time I heard that record, because the record I referred to in that earlier part with Charlie Green was Clap Your Hands, Here Comes Charlie. And Green plays a break that's somehow one note, and it's a growl, where he growls in his throat. I'm not going to try to demonstrate that. You can go find the record. And the astonishing thing is, Jimmy Harrison plays the same break on Oh Baby, recorded just a few years later, in 1928, I think it was 28, and I think Irvis's record was 25. The Oh Baby has Bobby Stark playing trumpet and Colin Hawkins playing the tenor, and it's an astonishing record and should be checked out also. But his level of virtuosity in a trombone is a little bit freer than Charlie Green's. His dexterity is definitely, he was playing lines more than riffs, which is what Charlie Green was, his soloing style really had a lot, was based in riff playing. I think that's because of Armstrong. I think Louis had a big influence on Jimmy Harrison particularly.
I want to stop and say one of the stories I read, and I don't know if it's true, from Shapiro and Hentoff, Hear Me Talking to You.
Yeah.
And again, since that book, none of that is sourced, I worry about these things. But Hawkins talking about jam sessions that he and Harrison and Jack Teagarden used to have up at Hawkins' apartment, and they would switch off, and that Hawkins would play piano, and I think Kaiser Marshall would play drums on a rubber pad.
Yeah, it sounds about right.
Yeah.
No, that's where things get really interesting, because I think by the late 20s, I think the jam session culture that was sort of romanticized by Eddie Condon and his many years of the Condon mob in its various forms. I think that really started. I think that whole idea of jam sessions and guys sharing ideas and playing together, and maybe polite competition, started in the mid-late 20s. I don't think the older guys like Charlie Green would have been involved so much in that kind of camaraderie, particularly the mixed race stuff, which I think really happened in the late 20s. I think that's sort of because I know there's the famous story about Louis and Bix playing together, locking the doors, and Eddie Lang and all those guys getting together at a restaurant and jamming. So I think that the Tea Garden, I think it's important to talk very specifically about an example that amazed me in comparison. I teach a class, and when I was teaching jazz history classes, I actually taught on this particular subject we're talking about today, and I had recorded examples. And one of the ones that blew my mind was hearing Harrison play on Benny Carter's record of D Blues, and then hearing Jack play on I think what is the blues that they recorded with Fats and his buddies, Walking Not Riding or something like that.
Riding not walking.
Riding Not Walking. And to hear if you compare Harrison's solo and Tea Garden's solo on those two tracks, they're just 12 bars. You'll learn everything you need to know about the fact that Tea Garden was heavily influenced by Jimmy Harrison, and probably vice versa. I think those two, and apparently they were personally, they were fond of each other, and I think actually spent time hanging out. And it's almost like they're almost two sides of the coin, you know. And it's really sad that Jimmy Harrison passed on so early, because I think Harrison would have been, could have been, you know, up in that pantheon of trombonists, maybe like Jack, but he died early too. I mean, a lot of these guys, tuberculosis wiped a lot of these guys out.
I think he was one of the guys, if I remember correctly, whose end was stomach cancer, which can't have been easy in 1931.
No, it was really, really rough. So yeah, to hear Jack and Jimmy Harrison is back to back is really an astonishing thing. I really think that those two guys fed off each other and inspired each other to play well. I don't know in those kind of situations, it's hard to know where one ends and one begins, you know. But the lines of Harrison's playing and then going into Jack's playing, I think really come out of the Armstrong vocabulary, and maybe particularly and the ease of playing. I think the trombone is an instrument that gets typecast as a kind of a rough instrument played by people who don't play it very well, which can be true. But to hear the dexterity and clarity, the one thing about Jack Teagarden's playing is his clarity of tone and ideas, his articulation. It's really a lot of it to me. It sounds like his interpretation of 30s Armstrong. You know, after Armstrong Armstrong developed into a ballad, more of a balladeer. You know, like 1930, 31. And I think, but even Jack and Jimmy Harrison were playing pretty, I would say, pretty dexterous trombone before that. To hear Jack, particularly in the 30s, is to really hear Armstrong's, kind of like Billie Holiday. You know how Billy singing develops that kind of, you know, it's not, lazy is not the correct term, but kind of ethereal quality, like I Can't Give You Anything But Love or something like that. You hear that, and you hear Armstrong playing those tunes in the 30s. I think Jack's playing has a lot of that, and I think that, like Jimmy Harrison, who didn't really make it into the 30s so much, not deep into the 40s, I think Harrison picks up on a lot of the Armstrong Hot Five stuff. I'm sure all those guys were learning Armstrong solos on their trombones. So that brings us to, hey, should we talk about JC a little bit?
I want to
yes,
throw you a curveball at the
moment,
go,
please.
Because Around 26, I think, 27, a young man comes into Henderson named Benny Morton, and he sounds so close to Jimmy Harrison that people can't figure out who's taking the solo sometimes.
Oh, I love Benny Morton. I love Benny Morton. Benny Morton's playing is, my friend Ray Shelbrad describes his tone as hauntingly hollow. But that's not an insult. There's a beautiful kind of middle part that's mysterious in his sound. He was actually from New York City, and he must have been a kid. And his playing almost accomplishes the goal of almost pulling together all of the New York elements into his style of playing, which comes to its greatest fruition on those great 1930s Don Redman sides, because he's all over those sides. He's a star soloist on almost every Don Redman record in 1931 through 33.
Even a little later, I could have my dates wrong, but there's the Don Redman film short at the Yeah Man Club,
yes,
where Morton stands up and takes the first major solo, and it's clear that somebody will be annoyed at me for saying this, but he is Redman's Lester Young.
Oh, there's no. I don't think there's any question about the depth of his playing, because his soloing style, particularly Don Redman used him to the best advantage of all, because Don Redman used him not just as a hot soloist, but you can't his solo, all the things just rushed to my mind, like I Got Rhythm, where he plays a lip trill. I think I'll demonstrate a lip trill to you for like 8 bars or something like that. So if I can produce one right now. Which is...
Let me stop you and just say, you're vibrating between one note and a note half a step.
No, they're actually partials. So in that case, I think it's a B flat to a C. So what happens is the way the overtone system's set up is you play higher, the notes get closer together. I think most people understand that. In a trombone, there's a big difference. Like if I play a B flat, there's a big space. You see, I have to go to the 6th position. But I get higher. In fact, we're even in the same position. So what the lip trill is and that's just between the two, a B flat and a C. Now, what that comes from is Armstrong. Although I'm not sure Armstrong did a lot of lip trills exactly. Armstrong had a hot vibrato. And I think a lot of guys maybe interpreted that as being a lip trill. And a lip trill is something that actually goes back to Arthur Pryor. In fact, if you study the Arbin book, which every trombone, even African-American trombone players, they had teachers, particularly the guys from the Northeast, because of Jim Europe and music education. These guys took proper lessons and they studied the Arbin book. There's a whole chapter on how to play a lip trill, and it talks about how you notate it and all this stuff. So it's a legit trombone technique, but like that Arthur Pryor did. But Benny Morton and Charlie Green, Benny Morton maybe more than anybody really brought it into the jazz world, and he could play those extraordinarily long lip trills, which almost, I think some people maybe do you think that some people confuse that with terminal vibrato, because they're different things?
Well, show terminal vibrato.
So again, and then the lip trill is, so they both involve your jaw, but the lip trill actually is going between 2 notes.
Yeah, I was going to say terminal vibrato is a broadening of the sound, one note.
Yeah, and in the case of those guys, you might think I'm exaggerating, but that's almost as much as those guys would exaggerate, really super exaggerate it.
I want to digress for a second
Yeah, sure,
and say
of course.
what I'm hearing in your playing, which, by the way, is beautiful, is a vocalized quality.
Yeah.
This is, if Arthur Pryor hadn't existed, my guess is that trombonists, as other instruments, would have picked up from the people who they knew who sang.
Correct. This is the whole thing about what Michael and I have discussed this at great length, so we'll share a bit with you out there. Is the fact that when you started out in the 1890s, early 1900s, what was the music you listened to? Well, high tone music was opera music, and all of the greats, Bechet is the first. Bechet really deserves credit for being the first of the guys to really incorporate the opera style, the singing style, in his playing. Armstrong is second, and that's one of the things that gave those guys the extra edge. I'm sure that if you were a guy, I don't know if you had a few records in your collection, you probably had maybe an Arthur Pryor, maybe a Herbert L. Clark, Sousa Band records, and you might have had opera singers. So that vocal style comes from trying to sing through your instrument, which is completely, which Armstrong covers in great detail. I mean, he talks about Italian opera a great deal in his recordings, thanks to Ricky Riccardi and the Armstrong House. All this stuff is available, and you can hear him talking. He had a working knowledge of opera. He could talk about opera and opera singers, and that's the thing that really starts us on the path of the soloist, the noble jazz soloist, was the idea that their models weren't jazz musicians like Bechet and Armstrong. They were modeling themselves off of Enrico Caruso or Emilita Gallicurci
Or John McCormick.
John McCormick would have been everywhere because John McCormick was a giant star. I mean, his records were everywhere, and he was ever present. And he was a media, like a kind of a, what you call a pop star. Everybody knew who John McCormick was. So that's a big part of it, and that's the thing that I think me and my friends, like your good friend Mark Caparone, and some of us we really always in our minds are trying to think, well, we're trying to get that extra expression from listening to opera. I listen to a lot of opera and classical music. Not because I'm a snob. I'm trying to. I want it all to seep into my brain, particularly the more singing things, the things that are like opera singing. It's just can really get in there and get you. If you're, I don't even know half the time what the guys are saying because I can barely speak English, but the expression and the sound, and I feel like you're getting closer to Bechet and Armstrong through that than you are trying to play their transcripted. I'm sorry, this will get me in trouble. Instead of trying to play transcriptions, it's almost better to listen to Enrico Caruso or John McCormick and just sit there and really concentrate on that stuff and how it affects you, and then to pull that into your playing than it is to try to play Armstrong note for note or Bechet note.
Well, before anybody attacks you, I want to have the punchline for this segment.
What is that?
The editor of the New Yorker, Harold Ross, said in a context that I don't remember, talent doesn't care where it resides. We'll be back in a minute.